Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote hollows of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1903 brought an unusual chill to Mason County, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of western West Virginia. The region, known for its dense forests and isolated homesteads, had always been a place where people minded their own business and kept family matters close to the vest. It was a landscape of rolling hills, narrow creek beds, and farmhouses separated by miles of wooded terrain, where the sound of a neighbor's axe splitting wood could carry for miles on a still morning. In this remote setting stood the Caldwell farmstead, a modest two-story wooden structure built sometime in the 1860s by Ezekiel Caldwell, a man who had carved his living from the unforgiving mountain soil. The house sat on a gentle slope overlooking Raccoon Creek, surrounded by approximately 60 acres of pasture land and timber. After Ezekiel's death in the winter of 1898, the property had passed to his widow, Minerva Caldwell, a woman then in her 47th year. Minerva was known throughout the county as a capable woman who had managed to maintain the farm, despite the challenges that came with rural isolation and the economic hardships following the Civil War. She was of medium height, with prematurely gray hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun, and dark brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Those who knew her described her as efficient, quiet, and possessed of a steely determination that had kept the Caldwell farm operational when many others in the region had been abandoned or sold. The farmhouse itself was typical of Appalachian construction from that era, built with locally sourced timber and designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters. The structure featured a wide front porch supported by rough-hewn posts, tall windows protected by wooden shutters, and a steep-pitched roof designed to shed snow and rain efficiently. The interior consisted of 6 main rooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room, a formal parlor, and 3 bedrooms on the second floor. What made Minerva's situation particularly notable was her practice of hiring seasonal workers, primarily drifters and men seeking temporary employment who would pass through the county looking for work. During harvest time and the busy spring planting season, it was not uncommon to see 3 or 4 such men working her fields, staying in the converted barn that served as makeshift quarters for hired hands. According to county employment records maintained at the courthouse in Point Pleasant, Minerva had consistently employed seasonal labor since taking over the farm's operations. These records, though incomplete due to the informal nature of such arrangements, show that between 1899 and 1903, she had hired at least 23 different men for periods ranging from a few weeks to several months. What struck those who later examined these documents was the absence of any forwarding addresses or next employment destinations for most of these workers. The practice of employing transient labor was common throughout rural Appalachia during this period. Men would travel from farm to farm, following seasonal work opportunities, often carrying their few possessions in a single bag, and sleeping wherever accommodations were offered. Many were veterans of the Civil War who had found it difficult to settle into civilian life. Others were simply men accustomed to a nomadic existence, moving from job to job without forming lasting attachments to any particular place. The economic conditions of post-Civil War Appalachia had created a large population of displaced men seeking work. The destruction caused by the conflict, combined with the collapse of local markets and the disruption of traditional social structures, had left many individuals without stable employment or permanent homes. These men formed a mobile workforce that moved throughout the region, taking whatever work was available and living under conditions that ranged from adequate to deplorable. Minerva's arrangement with these workers followed a consistent pattern, according to testimony later provided by merchants in the nearby town of Gallipolis Ferry. She would meet potential employees at Henderson's trading post, the primary gathering place for men seeking work in the area. After a brief conversation about wages and duties, she would offer employment that included room and board in addition to monetary compensation. The room was the converted barn, and the board consisted of 2 meals per day served in her kitchen. This arrangement appeared generous compared to what other local farmers typically offered. Most employers provided only basic sleeping quarters and expected workers to procure their own food or eat simple fare prepared outdoors. Minerva's offer of home-cooked meals served at her own table was viewed as unusually hospitable, and it was not difficult for her to find willing workers. The kitchen of the Caldwell farmhouse was the heart of the home, a large room that occupied nearly a third of the first floor. It featured a massive wood-burning stove manufactured by the Detroit Stove Works, a long wooden table that could seat 10 people, and a pantry that Minerva kept well stocked with preserved foods and dry goods purchased from traveling merchants. The room's most distinctive feature, however, was a heavy wooden door set into the floor near the far corner of the kitchen. This door provided access to the root cellar, a common feature in mountain homes used for storing vegetables and preserves through the winter months. The cellar beneath the kitchen had been excavated directly into the hillside when the house was built, taking advantage of the natural slope of the land to create a storage space that remained cool and dry year-round. Stone walls lined the excavation, and wooden shelves had been installed to hold jars, barrels, and other containers. The cellar extended approximately 15 feet back into the earth and was lined with stone walls that kept the temperature cool and consistent throughout the year. Wooden shelves lined the walls, and the floor was packed earth covered with wooden planks in some areas. Access was gained by descending a set of stone steps through the kitchen floor door. What made this cellar somewhat unusual was its size, and the fact that it appeared to extend further back into the hillside than the dimensions of the house would suggest. Several visitors to the farm over the years had noted that the cellar seemed disproportionately large, though Minerva had always explained this by saying that Ezekiel had been particularly ambitious in his excavation, wanting to ensure adequate storage space for their farming operation. The back portion of the cellar disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of lamplight, and Minerva kept this area blocked off with wooden barriers, claiming it was unsafe due to unstable soil conditions. The isolation of the Caldwell farm was both its strength and its vulnerability. Located nearly 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 8 miles from town, the property offered complete privacy and independence. The access road was little more than a dirt track that wound through dense forest, making the farm nearly invisible to casual travelers. During winter months, snow could make the road impassable for weeks at a time, cutting off all contact with the outside world. This isolation appealed to the transient workers who found employment with Minerva. Men who were accustomed to sleeping in barns, haystacks, or even outdoors welcomed the opportunity to work in a location where they would be left alone to perform their duties without interference from neighbors or local authorities. The remote location also meant that workers could rest and recover from the hard physical labor without being disturbed by the social obligations that might exist in more populated areas. The first indication that something might be amiss at the Caldwell farm came in the spring of 1903, when Josiah Henderson, the proprietor of Henderson's trading post, began to notice a pattern in his interactions with Minerva's hired workers. Men would arrive in town seeking employment, accept positions at the Caldwell farm, and then simply disappear from the area without completing their intended work periods or collecting their final wages. Initially, Henderson attributed these disappearances to the transient nature of such workers. It was not uncommon for men to abandon employment suddenly if they received word of better opportunities elsewhere, or if they simply grew restless and decided to move on. However, by late summer of 1903, the pattern had become too consistent to ignore. 9 different men had taken employment with Minerva since the beginning of the year, and none had been seen in town after starting work at her farm. This pattern came to Henderson's attention primarily because several of these men had left personal belongings at his trading post, with promises to retrieve them after receiving their first wages. A worn leather satchel belonging to a man named Barnabas Crouch had been sitting on a shelf behind the counter since March. A set of blacksmith's tools belonging to Cornelius Whitman had been stored in the back room since May. These items remained unclaimed, despite the fact that they represented significant value to working men who owned few possessions. Henderson's concern deepened when he realized that none of these missing workers had been seen on any of the roads leading out of the county. In a region where strangers were easily noticed and remembered, it was unusual for men to leave the area without being observed by someone. The network of informal communication that existed among rural communities meant that the movements of transient workers were generally tracked, if not officially recorded. The trading post served as an informal information center for the surrounding area, where farmers, merchants, and travelers would gather to exchange news and conduct business. Henderson made it his business to know about the comings and goings of people in the region, both as a matter of personal interest and as a way to maintain his position as a central figure in the local community. When men who had been regular customers simply vanished without explanation, he took notice. When Henderson eventually raised these concerns with Sheriff Thaddeus Garrison in early September 1903, the sheriff initially dismissed them as unfounded worry about men who had simply moved on to other employment. Garrison pointed out that transient workers were, by definition, unreliable and prone to sudden departures. He suggested that the men had probably left the area by less traveled routes or had departed during times when they were unlikely to be observed. Sheriff Garrison was a practical man who had served as the county's chief law enforcement officer for nearly 15 years. His experience had taught him that most missing person reports involving transient workers eventually resolved themselves when the individuals in question turned up in other counties or states. The mobile nature of seasonal labor meant that men could disappear from one area and reappear hundreds of miles away without anyone being aware of their movements. However, Garrison's perspective began to change when Henderson provided him with a detailed list of the missing men's names, descriptions, and personal belongings left behind. The list included information about each worker's claimed background, physical appearance, and the circumstances under which they had accepted employment with Minerva. What struck the sheriff as odd was the similarity in the men's situations. All were described as being without family ties, all had claimed to be traveling alone, and all had indicated that they had no specific destination in mind beyond finding temporary work. This pattern suggested either an remarkable coincidence or the possibility that Minerva was deliberately selecting workers who were unlikely to be missed or searched for if they disappeared. Men without family connections, permanent addresses, or established social networks would be ideal targets for someone with malicious intentions, as their absence would not trigger immediate concern or investigation. The similarities among the missing workers extended beyond their social circumstances. Most were described as being in their 30s or 40s, physically capable of performing farm labor and carrying modest amounts of money or valuable possessions. None had been known to have problems with alcohol or gambling that might explain sudden departures. All had been described by Henderson as reliable customers who had conducted their business in a straightforward manner. Acting on these suspicions, Sheriff Garrison decided to make an unofficial visit to the Caldwell farm in late September 1903. His stated purpose was to conduct a routine check on the welfare of any current hired workers and to inquire about the whereabouts of the men who had recently been employed there. This visit would prove to be the beginning of an investigation that would reveal disturbing truths about life at the isolated mountain farm. The journey to the Caldwell farm required nearly 2 hours of travel over rough terrain, emphasizing the property's isolation from the rest of the county. The dirt road wound through dense forest, crossed 2 creek beds, and climbed steadily into the mountains before finally emerging into the cleared area where the farmhouse stood. Sheriff Garrison noted that the remote location would make it easy for someone to conduct activities without being observed by neighbors or passing travelers. Minerva received Sheriff Garrison with what appeared to be complete cooperation and transparency. She invited him into her kitchen, offered him coffee and cornbread, and answered his questions with apparent honesty and concern. When asked about the missing workers, she expressed surprise and worry, stating that each man had left her employment suddenly and without explanation. She claimed that, in each case, the worker had simply failed to appear for morning duties and had apparently departed during the night, taking their belongings with them. To support her account, Minerva produced a ledger in which she recorded the employment details of her hired workers. The book contained entries for each of the missing men, including their names, start dates, wages earned, and work performed. Next to each entry, she had noted the date when the worker had departed without notice. The ledger appeared to be meticulously maintained and showed no obvious signs of alteration or fabrication. The ledger itself was an impressive document that demonstrated Minerva's organizational skills and attention to detail. Each entry included not only basic employment information, but also notes about the worker's performance, health, and behavior. Some entries contained personal observations about the men's backgrounds, skills, and stated intentions for future employment. The level of detail suggested that Minerva had taken genuine interest in her employees as individuals. When Sheriff Garrison asked to inspect the barn where the workers had been housed, Minerva readily agreed and accompanied him to the building. The barn showed evidence of recent habitation, with bedrolls, personal items, and makeshift furniture arranged in one section. Minerva explained that workers typically left behind items they considered too burdensome to carry when they departed suddenly. She pointed out clothing, tools, and personal effects that she said belonged to various former employees. What struck Sheriff Garrison as unusual during this inspection was the quantity and quality of the abandoned belongings. The items left behind included valuable tools, warm clothing suitable for mountain weather, and personal effects that men living a transient lifestyle would be unlikely to abandon voluntarily. A silver pocket watch, a well-crafted hunting knife, and a pair of expensive work boots were among the items that seemed too valuable to leave behind. The barn itself was well maintained and provided comfortable accommodations for workers. Minerva had partitioned off one section to create individual sleeping areas, each furnished with a bed, washstand, and storage chest. The accommodations were superior to what most transient workers could expect to find elsewhere, which made it even more puzzling that men would abandon such positions voluntarily. When questioned about these valuable items, Minerva maintained that transient workers often made impulsive decisions about what to carry with them. She suggested that men who departed suddenly might prioritize traveling light over recovering valuable possessions. While this explanation was plausible, Sheriff Garrison found it difficult to believe that so many different men would make similar decisions to abandon valuable belongings. During the course of his visit, Sheriff Garrison also had the opportunity to observe Minerva's current hired worker, a man named Zachariah Pemberton, who had been employed at the farm for approximately 4 weeks. Pemberton appeared to be in good health and spirits, expressing satisfaction with his employment and working conditions. He confirmed Minerva's account that previous workers had departed suddenly, saying that he had been surprised to find personal belongings left behind when he arrived. However, Sheriff Garrison noted something peculiar about Pemberton's demeanor during their conversation. While the worker appeared healthy and content, he seemed unusually deferential to Minerva, seeking her approval before answering questions and frequently glancing in her direction as if seeking guidance. This behavior struck the sheriff as odd for a man who was simply an employee rather than someone in a more dependent relationship. Pemberton also mentioned that Minerva had been particularly generous in providing him with hearty meals and had shown unusual concern for his health and comfort. He described elaborate dinners served in the farmhouse kitchen, with multiple courses and rich foods that were far superior to what he had experienced while working for other employers. This hospitality had impressed him greatly and had convinced him that he had found an ideal employment situation. Following his visit to the farm, Sheriff Garrison conducted additional inquiries in the surrounding area. He spoke with neighbors, other local farmers, and merchants in nearby towns, seeking any information about the movements or destinations of the missing workers. These inquiries yielded little useful information, but they did reveal one disturbing detail. Several people reported having heard unusual sounds coming from the direction of the Caldwell farm during nighttime hours. These sounds were described as low, rhythmic noises that some witnesses compared to digging or heavy objects being moved. The sounds typically occurred during the late evening or early morning hours and seemed to originate from the area around the farmhouse rather than the fields or barn. While such sounds might normally be attributed to routine farm activities, their timing and frequency had attracted attention from neighbors who lived within hearing distance. One neighbor, Ezekiel Brennan, who lived approximately 3/4 of a mile from the Caldwell farm, provided particularly detailed testimony about these mysterious sounds. Brennan, a former cavalry soldier who suffered from chronic insomnia related to his military service, often spent sleepless nights sitting on his porch or walking his property. Over the course of the summer of 1903, he had noticed a pattern of activity at the Caldwell farm that seemed inconsistent with normal farming operations. According to Brennan's account, he had observed lights moving around the Caldwell farmhouse during very late hours, often between midnight and 4 in the morning. These lights appeared to be lanterns or torches rather than the steady glow of interior lamps, and they seemed to move in patterns suggesting that someone was carrying them while performing some type of outdoor work. On several occasions he had heard the sounds of metal tools striking earth consistent with digging activities. Most disturbing to Brennan was his observation that these late-night activities seemed to occur with suspicious regularity following the disappearance of hired workers. He reported that the pattern typically began with the arrival of a new employee, continued for several weeks with normal farming activities, and then culminated in a night of unusual activity, followed by the worker's disappearance. This pattern had repeated itself multiple times throughout the year. Brennan's military background had taught him to be observant of unusual activities and to maintain detailed mental records of what he witnessed. His testimony was particularly credible because he was known in the community as a reliable and sober individual who was not given to flights of imagination or exaggeration. When he reported seeing something unusual, people tended to believe him. The distance between Brennan's property and the Caldwell farm was significant, but the mountainous terrain and sparse vegetation allowed sound to carry much farther than it would in more densely populated areas. On clear, still nights, it was possible to hear activities from considerable distances, especially sounds like metal striking stone or the movement of heavy objects across hard ground. Brennan's testimony provided Sheriff Garrison with the first concrete evidence that the disappearances at the Caldwell farm might not be voluntary departures. The correlation between late-night digging activities and worker disappearances suggested that the missing men might have met with foul play and been buried somewhere on the property. This possibility transformed the investigation from a missing persons inquiry into a potential murder case. Armed with this new information, Sheriff Garrison made the decision to conduct a more thorough investigation of the Caldwell farm. However, he faced significant legal and practical challenges in pursuing this course of action. Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, he could not obtain a search warrant that would allow him to excavate the property or conduct an extensive investigation. Additionally, the remote location and large size of the farm meant that any search would require considerable resources and manpower. The legal constraints of rural law enforcement in 1903 were significant. Sheriff Garrison's authority was limited by both statutory restrictions and practical considerations. He could not simply decide to search private property based on suspicion alone, especially when dealing with a respected member of the community like Minerva Caldwell. Any investigation would need to be conducted carefully to avoid legal challenges or community backlash. Rather than proceeding with an immediate formal investigation, Sheriff Garrison decided to implement a surveillance operation to monitor activities at the Caldwell farm. He arranged for deputies to observe the property from concealed positions during nighttime hours, hoping to document any suspicious activities that might provide grounds for more aggressive law enforcement action. This surveillance began in early October 1903, just as winter weather was beginning to make outdoor activities more challenging. The surveillance operation was complicated by the remote location of the farm and the dense forest that surrounded the property. Finding concealed observation positions that provided adequate views of the farmhouse while remaining undetected required careful planning and considerable skill. Sheriff Garrison assigned his most experienced deputy, Marshal Quincy, to oversee the operation. Deputy Quincy was a former Army scout who had extensive experience in wilderness observation and covert operations. His military training had taught him how to remain concealed for extended periods while maintaining careful watch over target areas. He selected observation positions in the wooded hills overlooking the farm that provided clear views of the farmhouse, barn, and immediate grounds. The surveillance operation initially yielded little useful information. During the first 3 weeks of October, deputies reported normal farming activities during daylight hours and no unusual nighttime activities. Zachariah Pemberton continued his employment at the farm, and there were no indications of anything suspicious occurring on the property. Sheriff Garrison began to wonder if his suspicions were unfounded and if the missing workers had indeed simply moved on to other employment. However, this period of normalcy came to an abrupt end on the night of October 23, 1903. Deputy Quincy, who was conducting surveillance from a position in the woods overlooking the farmhouse, observed a series of events that confirmed the worst suspicions about activities at the Caldwell farm. According to Deputy Quincy's detailed report, filed the following morning, the evening had been quiet until approximately 9:30 p.m., when he observed Zachariah Pemberton returning to the farmhouse from the barn where he had been staying. This in itself was not unusual, as workers often visited the main house to use washing facilities or to speak with their employer about the next day's work. However, what followed was far from routine. Pemberton entered the farmhouse through the kitchen door and appeared to engage in conversation with Minerva. Through the kitchen window, Deputy Quincy could see both figures moving about the room, apparently preparing for a late evening meal. This continued for approximately 45 minutes, with both individuals seeming to participate normally in conversation and domestic activities. The kitchen was well lit by multiple oil lamps, providing Deputy Quincy with a clear view of the activities inside. He observed Minerva preparing what appeared to be an elaborate meal, setting the table with her finest dishes, and preparing multiple courses of food. Pemberton assisted with some of the preparations and appeared to be in good spirits, laughing and talking with his employer. At approximately 10:45 p.m., Deputy Quincy observed Minerva move toward the heavy wooden door that provided access to the root cellar. She appeared to unlock this door with a key that she kept on a chain around her neck, then opened the door and descended into the cellar below. During the time that Minerva was below, Pemberton remained in the kitchen, apparently waiting for her return while continuing to tend to the meal preparations. When Minerva emerged from the cellar approximately 15 minutes later, she was carrying what appeared to be a dark glass bottle. She placed this container on the kitchen counter and appeared to add a portion of its contents to a serving dish that contained what looked like stew or soup. Deputy Quincy noted that throughout this process, Pemberton seemed unaware of what Minerva was doing, as he was facing away from the counter and appeared to be tending to the fire in the kitchen stove. The meal that followed appeared normal for the first 30 minutes, with both individuals sitting at the kitchen table and eating while engaged in conversation. However, Deputy Quincy noticed that as the meal progressed, Pemberton's behavior began to change. He appeared to become increasingly sluggish and disoriented, eventually having difficulty holding his utensils properly and swaying slightly in his chair. Minerva continued eating and showed no apparent concern for Pemberton's condition. In fact, Deputy Quincy observed that she seemed to be watching Pemberton carefully, as if monitoring his deteriorating condition with interest rather than alarm. When Pemberton finally slumped forward in his chair and became motionless, Minerva calmly finished her own meal before rising from the table. After completing her meal, Minerva rose from the table and began clearing the dishes in a methodical manner. She then moved to where Pemberton sat motionless and appeared to check his condition, lifting one of his arms and allowing it to fall back to his side, then placing her ear near his chest as if listening to his breathing. Satisfied with whatever she observed, she then moved again to the cellar door, unlocking it and descending into the space below. When Minerva emerged from the cellar a second time, she was carrying several items that Deputy Quincy could not clearly identify in the lamplight. These appeared to include tools of some kind, possibly including a shovel and other digging implements. She placed these items near the kitchen door and then returned to Pemberton, who remained motionless in his chair. What happened next, according to Deputy Quincy's testimony, was the most disturbing aspect of the entire evening's events. Minerva appeared to lift Pemberton from his chair, supporting his weight and moving him toward the open cellar door. The unconscious man offered no resistance as she maneuvered him to the opening, and then, with considerable effort, managed to move him down into the cellar below. The physical demands of moving an unconscious adult male would have been considerable for a woman of Minerva's size and age. However, Deputy Quincy observed that she seemed to accomplish this task with surprising efficiency, suggesting that she had previous experience with similar activities. The deliberate nature of her actions indicated that this was not an impulsive act, but rather the execution of a well-practiced plan. Deputy Quincy reported that after both figures had disappeared into the cellar, he could hear sounds of activity coming from below the kitchen floor. These sounds included what appeared to be dragging noises, the scraping of tools against earth, and periodic heavy impacts that might have been caused by digging or the movement of heavy objects. This activity continued for approximately 3 hours, during which time the deputy observed occasional flashes of light through the small cellar windows, consistent with someone working by lantern light in the underground space. The sounds that emerged from the cellar were consistent with excavation activities, but they also included other noises that Deputy Quincy found more difficult to identify. There were periodic thuds and scraping sounds that might have been caused by the movement of heavy objects, as well as what sounded like the systematic filling and tamping of earth. The pattern of sound suggested organized, purposeful activity rather than random or panicked behavior. At approximately 3:45 a.m., Minerva emerged from the cellar alone. She was carrying the same tools she had taken down earlier, and her clothing appeared to be soiled with dirt and other substances. She spent several minutes washing her hands and arms at the kitchen sink, then carefully cleaned the tools before returning them to the cellar. Finally, she locked the cellar door and extinguished the lanterns, leaving the kitchen in darkness. Deputy Quincy remained in position until dawn, but observed no further activity at the farmhouse. In the morning, he saw Minerva emerge from the house and perform what appeared to be routine morning chores, including feeding livestock and collecting eggs from the hen house. There was no sign of Zachariah Pemberton, nor any indication that another person was present on the property. The deputy's account of what he had witnessed was detailed and methodical, reflecting his military training in observation and reporting. He had maintained careful notes throughout the night, recording times, descriptions of activities, and other relevant details that would be crucial for any subsequent investigation. His testimony would prove to be the key evidence in building a case against Minerva Caldwell. Based on Deputy Quincy's testimony, Sheriff Garrison obtained a warrant to search the Caldwell farm and arrest Minerva on suspicion of murder. The warrant was executed on October 25, 1903, with a team of deputies and volunteers equipped with the digging tools and equipment necessary to conduct a thorough search of the property. When the officers arrived at the farmhouse, Minerva offered no resistance to their presence and appeared resigned to the investigation. She answered initial questions in a calm, matter-of-fact manner and provided keys and access to all areas of the property. Her demeanor throughout the early stages of the search was notably composed, showing little emotion even when officers began preparing to excavate areas around the farmhouse. The search of the main house revealed little of immediate interest, aside from confirming the layout and features that had been observed during previous visits. The kitchen, sitting room, and bedrooms appeared normal and contained no obvious evidence of criminal activity. However, officers did note that Minerva's personal belongings included an unusually large collection of men's items, including clothing, tools, and personal effects that seemed inconsistent with her status as a widow living alone. The barn and other outbuildings were also searched thoroughly, revealing the quarters where workers had been housed and the personal belongings that had been abandoned by previous employees. The quantity and value of these items continued to strike investigators as suspicious, particularly given the claims that the men had departed voluntarily. However, the investigation of the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor would prove to be far more revealing. When officers unlocked the cellar door and descended into the underground space, they immediately noticed that the earth floor showed signs of recent disturbance. Areas of soil appeared to have been recently excavated and refilled, and the packed earth surface was uneven in several locations. Additionally, the air in the cellar carried a distinctly unpleasant odor that was inconsistent with the typical smells associated with root vegetable storage. The cellar was larger than the officers had expected, extending well back into the hillside beyond the foundation of the house above. The stone walls were well constructed and appeared to have been built with considerable skill and attention to detail. However, the earthen floor showed clear evidence of repeated disturbance, with several areas appearing to have been excavated and refilled multiple times. Systematic excavation of the cellar floor began immediately, with officers working carefully to document the location and condition of any evidence discovered. Within the first hour of digging, they uncovered human remains buried at a depth of approximately 4 feet below the surface. These remains were quickly identified as belonging to Zachariah Pemberton, based on clothing and personal effects found with the body. The condition of Pemberton's remains provided disturbing insights into the method of killing that had been used. The body showed no obvious signs of violence or trauma that would indicate death by conventional means. However, the positioning of the remains and the condition of the clothing suggested that the victim had been buried while unconscious but still alive. Soil found in the victim's mouth and throat indicated that death had resulted from suffocation after being placed in the grave. Continued excavation revealed additional human remains buried at various depths and locations throughout the cellar floor. By the end of the first day of searching, officers had discovered the remains of 6 different individuals, all adult men whose physical characteristics matched descriptions of missing seasonal workers. Each body had been buried individually in carefully prepared graves, and personal effects found with the remains helped confirm the identities of most of the victims. The systematic nature of the burials indicated that the killings had been planned and executed with considerable care and attention to detail. Each grave had been excavated to a precise depth and then carefully refilled and concealed. The positioning of the bodies suggested that the victims had been placed in the graves while unconscious, then buried alive in a methodical manner that ensured their deaths while minimizing the risk of detection. Additional evidence found in the cellar included several bottles containing an unknown liquid substance, which was later identified through chemical analysis as a powerful sedative that could be extracted from certain plants native to the Appalachian region. This substance, when added to food or drink in sufficient quantities, would render a person unconscious within a short time and keep them incapacitated for several hours. Minerva had apparently been using this substance to drug her victims before burying them alive in the cellar floor. The sedative was derived from a combination of local plants that were commonly used in folk medicine throughout the region. Minerva's knowledge of these plants and their properties suggested that she had considerable experience with traditional healing practices, knowledge that she had perverted to serve her murderous purposes. The careful preparation and storage of the sedative indicated that the killings had been planned well in advance. Further investigation of the cellar revealed evidence of the tools and methods that Minerva had used to carry out her crimes. Hidden behind shelves of preserved foods, officers discovered shovels, pickaxes, and other digging implements that showed clear signs of recent use. There were also supplies for mixing and preparing the sedative, including grinding implements, measuring devices, and storage containers. When confronted with the physical evidence discovered in her cellar, Minerva initially maintained her innocence and claimed that she had no knowledge of how the bodies had come to be buried there. She suggested that the victims might have been killed by someone else and their bodies hidden in her cellar without her knowledge. However, this explanation was clearly inconsistent with the systematic nature of the burials and the evidence of ongoing use of the cellar for this purpose. Under continued questioning by Sheriff Garrison and other investigators, Minerva's composure began to deteriorate, and she eventually provided a partial confession to the murders. According to her statement, she had begun killing seasonal workers out of a combination of financial desperation and a growing conviction that the transient men who worked for her were essentially worthless individuals who would not be missed by society. Minerva claimed that the isolated location of her farm and the transient nature of her workers had made her realize that she could eliminate these men without detection. She rationalized her actions by arguing that the men were temporary and expendable, and that their deaths served to protect her property and provide her with their possessions and wages. She also suggested that the men had been taking advantage of her hospitality and that their elimination was a form of justice. However, investigators suspected that Minerva's motives were more complex than simple financial gain or social resentment. The systematic nature of the killings and the cruel method used suggested a level of psychological disturbance that went beyond rational criminal motivation. The fact that she had continued the pattern of hiring and killing workers over an extended period indicated a compulsive element to her behavior that could not be explained solely by practical considerations. The investigation revealed that Minerva had systematically stolen the possessions and wages of her victims, accumulating a significant amount of money and valuable items over the course of several years. Hidden throughout the farmhouse and barn, officers discovered cash, jewelry, tools, and other personal effects that had belonged to the murdered workers. This theft, appeared to have been carefully planned, with Minerva maintaining detailed records of the items taken from each victim. A thorough inventory of the stolen property revealed the extent of Minerva's criminal activities beyond the murders themselves. She had accumulated watches, rings, knives, tools, and other valuable items that represented the life savings and prized possessions of working men who had trusted her with their lives. The total value of the stolen property was estimated at several $1,000s, a substantial sum for that time period. Further investigation revealed additional disturbing details about Minerva's background and the history of the Caldwell farm. County records showed that her husband Ezekiel had died under somewhat mysterious circumstances in 1898, with the official cause of death listed as accidental drowning in Raccoon Creek. However, re-examination of this case in light of the Cellar discoveries raised questions about whether Ezekiel's death had actually been accidental. Neighbors interviewed during the investigation reported that Ezekiel and Minerva's marriage had been troubled, with frequent arguments and periods of obvious tension between the couple. Several witnesses recalled that Ezekiel had expressed fears about his wife's mental state in the months before his death, and some had observed him to be increasingly nervous and watchful when in her presence. One neighbor specifically remembered Ezekiel mentioning that he was concerned about Minerva's strange ideas about people who didn't deserve to live. The circumstances of Ezekiel's death were also suspicious upon closer examination. He had allegedly drowned in a creek that was relatively shallow during the winter when his death occurred. Ezekiel was known to be a competent swimmer who had lived near the water his entire life, making accidental drowning unlikely under normal circumstances. His body had been discovered by Minerva, who claimed to have found him while searching after he failed to return from checking on livestock. The investigation at the time of Ezekiel's death had been perfunctory, conducted by a part-time constable who lacked the training and resources to thoroughly investigate suspicious deaths. The official report consisted of only a few paragraphs and contained no detailed examination of the circumstances or evidence. Given the evidence discovered in the cellar and Minerva's demonstrated capacity for calculated murder, investigators concluded that Ezekiel had likely been her first victim. The possibility that Minerva had killed her husband raised additional questions about the timeline of her criminal activities. If Ezekiel's death had been murder rather than an accident, it suggested that Minerva's killing spree had begun earlier than initially believed and that she had spent years perfecting her methods before beginning to target seasonal workers. The root cellar may have been excavated or expanded after Ezekiel's death specifically to serve as a burial ground for future victims. County property records revealed that the Caldwell farm had been significantly modified during the years following Ezekiel's death. Minerva had contracted for extensive excavation work on the property, ostensibly to improve drainage and create additional storage space. However, much of this work had been concentrated in the area around the farmhouse, particularly in the expansion of the root cellar beneath the kitchen. The men who had performed this excavation work were questioned during the investigation. Several recalled that Minerva had been unusually specific about the dimensions and depth of the cellar expansion, providing detailed instructions that seemed to go beyond what would be necessary for simple food storage. She had also insisted on doing much of the finishing work herself, claiming that she wanted to ensure the job was done to her satisfaction. The trial of Minerva Caldwell began in the spring of 1904 and attracted significant attention throughout the region and beyond. The case was unusual not only because of the number of victims and the cruel method of killing, but also because of the systematic nature of the crimes and the defendant's gender. Female serial killers were extremely rare in rural America during this period, and the case challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of criminal behavior. Newspaper coverage of the trial was extensive, with reporters from major cities traveling to the remote county to cover the proceedings. The combination of multiple murders, a female defendant, and the isolated mountain setting captured the public imagination and generated widespread interest in the case. Daily newspapers provided detailed coverage of testimony and evidence, bringing the story to readers across the country. During the trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence linking Minerva to the murders, including the remains found in her cellar, the sedative substances found in her possession, and the stolen property discovered throughout her home. Deputy Quincy's eyewitness testimony of the events on October 23, 1903, provided crucial evidence about Minerva's methods and behavior. The testimony was particularly compelling because of the deputy's military background and his reputation for accuracy and reliability. The defense attempted to argue that Minerva was mentally incompetent and could not be held responsible for her actions. They presented testimony from neighbors and acquaintances suggesting that she had shown signs of mental instability following her husband's death and that her behavior had become increasingly erratic over time. However, the systematic nature of the crimes and the evidence of careful planning made it difficult to support an insanity defense. Expert witnesses called by the prosecution testified about the planning and premeditation evident in the crimes. The preparation of sedatives, the expansion of the cellar, the systematic selection of victims, and the careful concealment of evidence all indicated rational thought and deliberate planning rather than the actions of someone who was mentally incompetent. The defense struggled to counter this evidence with credible, alternative explanations. Minerva herself provided limited testimony during the trial, maintaining that she had acted in self-defense against men who she claimed had threatened or attacked her. She suggested that the workers had attempted to rob or harm her, and that she had responded with force to protect herself and her property. However, this explanation was clearly inconsistent with the evidence of premeditation and the cruel method of killing used. The prosecution presented evidence demonstrating that all of the victims had been killed while unconscious and unable to pose any threat to Minerva. The systematic nature of the poisoning and burial process made it impossible to credibly claim self-defense. Additionally, witness testimony established that the victims had been content with their employment and had shown no signs of planning to harm their employer. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Minerva was sentenced to death, making her one of the few women in West Virginia history to receive capital punishment for murder. The sentence was carried out in February 1905, bringing an end to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Appalachian history. Following Minerva's execution, the Caldwell farm was sold to pay legal expenses and compensate the families of victims who could be identified. The new owners attempted to operate the property as a working farm, but found it difficult to attract workers willing to live on land associated with such horrific crimes. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned and allowed to deteriorate, becoming a source of local legends and cautionary tales. The cellar where the victims had been buried was sealed with stones and concrete, and the kitchen floor was permanently covered to prevent access to the underground space. However, these measures did little to diminish the farm's reputation as a place of evil, and the property remained largely unoccupied for many years following the murders. Local residents avoided the area, and the access road gradually became overgrown with vegetation. In the years that followed, the Caldwell farm case became the subject of academic study and criminal justice research. Criminologists and psychologists examined the evidence and trial records to better understand the motivations and methods of female serial killers, particularly in rural settings where such crimes could continue undetected for extended periods. The case provided valuable insights into the psychology of organized serial killing and the conditions that could enable such crimes to continue. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of transient workers and seasonal laborers who often lived and worked in isolated conditions with little protection from exploitation or violence. The fact that 9 men had been murdered over the course of several years without their disappearances being immediately investigated demonstrated the marginal status of such workers in rural society. This recognition led to some improvements in the tracking and protection of mobile workers, though significant vulnerabilities remained. Local historians documented the lasting impact of the Caldwell murders on the communities surrounding Mason County. The crimes reinforced existing suspicions about strangers and outsiders, making it more difficult for legitimate seasonal workers to find employment in the region. Many farmers stopped hiring transient labor entirely, preferring to rely on family members or established local workers rather than risk association with dangerous individuals. The case also contributed to changes in law enforcement practices throughout rural West Virginia. Sheriff's departments began maintaining more detailed records about transient workers and seasonal laborers, and developed protocols for investigating the disappearances of such individuals more thoroughly. The West Virginia State Police also began conducting periodic welfare checks on farms that regularly employed temporary workers. In 1923, 20 years after the murders, the abandoned Caldwell farmhouse was destroyed by fire under circumstances that were never fully explained. Local fire departments reported that the blaze appeared to have started in the kitchen area near the location of the former cellar access, but no definitive cause was ever determined. Some residents suspected arson, while others attributed the fire to natural causes such as lightning or deteriorating electrical systems. The destruction of the farmhouse marked the end of the physical reminders of the Caldwell murders, but the psychological impact of the crimes continued to influence the region for many years afterward. Stories about the widow's cellar became part of local folklore, serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of trusting strangers and the evil that could hide beneath the surface of rural community life. Documentation of the Caldwell case was preserved in county court records and state police files, but much of the evidence and testimony was not widely accessible to researchers until the 1960s. When academic investigators finally gained access to the complete case files, they found a wealth of information about rural crime patterns and the social conditions that had allowed such systematic murders to continue undetected for years. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case that emerged from later research was the extent to which Minerva had been able to maintain a facade of respectability while committing multiple murders. Neighbors, merchants, and even law enforcement officials had viewed her as a competent and moral woman who was successfully managing a difficult situation as a widow operating a farm alone. This positive reputation had provided her with protection from suspicion and had made it easier for her to continue attracting victims. The psychological profile that emerged from analysis of the evidence suggested that Minerva had developed a complex system of rationalization for her crimes. She appeared to genuinely believe that the men she murdered were socially worthless individuals whose death served a positive purpose by removing undesirable elements from the community. This self-justification had allowed her to continue killing without experiencing the guilt or remorse that might have deterred other criminals. Modern criminal psychologists who have studied the Caldwell case consider it an early example of what would later be classified as organized serial killing. Minerva's crimes showed evidence of careful planning, systematic execution, and effective concealment that demonstrated a high level of criminal sophistication. Her ability to maintain normal social relationships while committing murders over an extended period indicated a capacity for compartmentalization that is characteristic of successful serial killers. The case also demonstrated the particular vulnerabilities of rural communities to this type of crime during the early 20th century. The isolation of farms, the transient nature of seasonal labor, and the limited law enforcement resources available in remote areas had all contributed to creating conditions where systematic murder could continue undetected. These factors remained relevant to understanding rural crime patterns well into the modern era. By 1965, the Caldwell farm property had been subdivided and partially developed for residential use, with several modern homes built on portions of the land where the original farmhouse had stood. The new residents were generally unaware of the property's history, as local real estate practices did not require disclosure of historical crimes that had occurred on residential land. However, some longtime residents of the area continued to remember the location's dark past and occasionally shared stories about the murders with newcomers. The sealed cellar location remained undisturbed beneath the modern development, as construction crews had been instructed to build around the area rather than excavate it. County building records indicated that this decision had been made partly out of respect for the victims and partly out of practical considerations related to the difficulty and expense of properly excavating and documenting the site. In the final analysis, the Caldwell murders represent one of the most systematic and prolonged serial killing cases in Appalachian criminal history. The combination of opportunity, isolation, and psychological disturbance that enabled Minerva to commit these crimes provides important insights into the conditions that can foster such extreme criminal behavior. The case serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind facades of respectability and that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most normal to their communities. The victims of Minerva's crimes were largely forgotten by history, their names recorded only in court documents and police files. Most were buried in unmarked graves in the county cemetery, identified only by the personal effects found with their remains. They remain representative of countless other transient workers who lived and died in obscurity during this period, whose disappearances went unnoticed and whose lives were deemed expendable by society. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Caldwell case is its demonstration of the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The ease with which Minerva was able to prey upon homeless and transient workers highlighted the need for better social services and law enforcement protections for such individuals. While significant progress has been made in these areas over the decades, the basic conditions that enabled the Caldwell murders to occur continue to exist in many rural communities today. The story of the widow's kitchen cellar door thus remains relevant, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about the capacity for human evil and the responsibility of communities to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, the true horror of the Caldwell murders lay not in their methods or their scale, but in their demonstration of how easily human life can be discarded when society fails to value the dignity and worth of every individual. The echoes of what happened in that remote Appalachian farmhouse more than a century ago continue to resonate today, reminding us that the price of safety and justice is constant vigilance and the recognition that evil often wears the mask of respectability. The men who died in Minerva Caldwell's cellar deserve to be remembered, not just as victims of a disturbed killer, but as human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths diminished us all.